Forget it! Did you lock the door?
Imagine this. You're halfway to work, moving on autopilot through your morning commute, and then a sudden cold thought slices through the fog of your routine. Did I lock the front door? For a moment, your heart stops. You almost turn back, but you're already late. It's probably fine, right? Today, we are going to share 3 true chilling stories about people who forgot one simple important thing and what happened next. It is a universal, gut-wrenching feeling. That sudden jolt of panic, the frantic retracing of your steps in your own mind. We've all felt the cold dread of a simple mistake. But the real fear isn't just about leaving a door unlocked or a phone on a restaurant table. It's the horrifying knowledge of our own fallibility. It's the quiet, gnawing anxiety that a single momentary lapse in our memory, a tiny crack in our routine, can be the one thing that invites a nightmare into our lives. But what if that single act of forgetting wasn't a mistake? What if, in some strange, terrifying way, it was fate? By exploring these real, unnerving accounts, from a forgotten lock that led to a horrifying discovery, to a forgotten item that saved a life, we will confront the chilling reality of what happens in the moments we can't remember. These stories are a disturbing look at the thin, fragile line that separates a simple oversight from a life-altering consequence. Now, before we retrace our steps, make sure you are subscribed to Whispered Fear and have activated the bell. It's a small detail you won't want to forget. Welcome home. Our first story is about the most common, and perhaps the most terrifying, of all human errors. The simple act of forgetfulness. It's about that cold, sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach when you realize you've left your sanctuary vulnerable. It comes from a woman named Laura, a young lawyer who learned that a single, forgotten deadbolt can be the only thing standing between a normal life and an absolute, soul-shattering nightmare. At 29, Laura's life was a carefully constructed fortress built on a foundation of control. She was a junior associate at a competitive law firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, Moore and Van Allen, one of the giants that occupied the upper floors of the Bank of America Corporate Center. Her life was a grueling marathon of billable hours, of meticulous legal research, and of a constant low-grade, high-stakes anxiety. She was good at her job because she was a perfectionist. She checked every citation, every footnote, every detail. Her mind was her greatest asset, a finely tuned machine of logic and order. This obsession with control was not just professional. It was personal. It was the armor she wore against a world that had, in her past, proven to be chaotic and unpredictable. Her sanctuary, the one place where she could finally lower her shield, was a small historic carriage house she rented in the 4th Ward, a beautiful, quiet neighborhood of restored Victorian homes and brick-paved sidewalks. The house, tucked away on West 9th Street, was her escape. It was small, but it was hers. It was a place of quiet, ordered peace, a stark contrast to the aggressive, steel and glass world of her job. She had a routine that was as precise as a legal brief. She would come home, lock the door, slide the chain, and for a few precious hours, the chaotic world could not touch her. The morning her world was breached began like any other, with a jolt of caffeine-fueled panic. She had woken up late. An important brief was due by noon, and a rare, early morning meeting with a senior partner had been added to her calendar. At the last minute, her usual calm morning routine dissolved into a frantic, chaotic rush. She showered in record time, threw on a suit, and juggled a piece of toast and her work laptop as she ran around the small house, her mind already in the conference room on the 45th floor. She ran out the front door at 8:15 a.m., pulling it shut behind her. The sound of the latch clicking into place a familiar, final sound. She fumbled with her keys, her mind a frantic checklist of the day ahead. She got in her car, threw her briefcase on the passenger seat, and sped off into the morning traffic of uptown Charlotte. It was halfway to work, while she was sitting in the familiar gridlock on I-277, that the thought, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced the fog of her morning panic. The deadbolt. She hadn't locked it. She remembered pulling the door shut. She remembered the click of the latch, but she had no memory of the final crucial step. The deliberate, physical act of turning the key in the deadbolt. The one act that separated closed from secure. A wave of cold, nauseating anxiety washed over her. She told herself, her hands gripping the steering wheel, "It's fine. You were in a rush. You probably did it and just don't remember." But her mind, her meticulous, detail-oriented mind, knew the truth. It was a muscle memory, an ingrained physical ritual, and she could not, for the life of her, recall the feeling of the key turning, of the heavy bolt sliding home. The traffic began to move. She could keep going. She was already late. Going back would make her catastrophically late. It would be unprofessional. It would be a sign of weakness in a world that did not tolerate it. Her neighborhood was safe. It was the middle of the day. The chances of anything happening were infinitesimally small. It was a logical calculation. But the feeling, the deep, primal, illogical feeling of a door left open, of a sanctuary left vulnerable. It was a roar that drowned out all the quiet, sensible voices of logic. She made a decision. At the next exit, she pulled off the highway and began the frantic backtracking drive through the city, her anxiety growing with every passing red light. She was being paranoid. She was going to get home, find the door securely locked, and feel like a fool for the rest of the day. It was a small price to pay for peace of mind. She finally turned onto her quiet, tree-lined street. The familiar, historic houses stood in the calm morning light. Everything was normal. She pulled up to her small carriage house, and her heart stopped. The front door was not just unlocked. It was open. It was wide open. A dark, gaping, and impossible invitation into the heart of her home. She sat in her car for a long, silent moment, her mind a complete and total blank. This was not possible. She had pulled the door shut. She had heard it latch. A door doesn't just open itself. The wind? No, the air was still. Her first thought was a robbery. Her second thought was a new, more personal kind of terror. The open door was not just a violation. It was a message, a statement. Your locks mean nothing. Your sanctuary is not yours. She fumbled for her phone and dialed 911, her voice a trembling, barely audible whisper. The dispatcher was calm, professional, telling her to stay in her car, that officers were on their way. But she couldn't just sit there. Her life was in that house, her journals, her photos, her entire private world. Against every instinct of self-preservation, she got out of the car. The silence of the street was absolute. She walked slowly up the stone path, her footsteps sounding impossibly loud. She stood in the open doorway and peered into the darkness of her own home. She called out, her voice a small, thin thing. "Hello?" Only silence answered. The house was not ransacked. Nothing seemed to be out of place. Her laptop was still on the coffee table. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. This was not a robbery. This was something else. And then she saw them, the footprints. They started just inside the doorway. They were not her footprints. They were large, made by a heavy work boot, the kind a construction worker might wear. And they were caked in. A thick, dark, reddish-brown mud, a type of wet, clay-like soil that was completely alien to the manicured lawns and clean sidewalks of her historic neighborhood. She followed them with her eyes, a trail of dirty, violating marks on her pristine, newly refinished hardwood floors. The footprints led from the front door, through the living room, past the kitchen. They didn't stop at her electronics. They didn't stop at her valuables. They walked a straight, deliberate, and terrifying path, down the short hallway to the one place in the house that was the most private, the most sacred. They led directly to the closed door of her bedroom. She stood at the entrance to the hallway, her body trembling, her mind a screaming siren of pure, undiluted terror. He was still in there. The man with the muddy boots. He was in her bedroom, waiting. She backed away slowly, out of the open door, back onto the porch, her eyes locked on the bedroom door at the end of the hall. She was fumbling for her phone again when the first Charlotte Mecklenburg police car pulled up to the curb, its lights flashing but its siren silent. The relief was so profound it almost buckled her knees. 2 officers, a man and a woman, got out of the car, their faces calm and professional. She ran to them, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a chaotic, sobbing stream. The open door, the footprints, the man in her bedroom. The officers were calm, efficient. One stayed with her while the other drew his weapon and entered the house. His movements a silent, practiced ballet of tactical precision. She stood on the lawn, her arms wrapped around herself, and waited, her eyes fixed on the front of her violated home. A few minutes later, the officer emerged. His weapon was a jolt, irritated. His voice was gentle. "The house is clear, ma'am. There's no one inside." She stammered, but the footprints. They led to the bedroom. The officer said, a strange, unreadable expression on his face, "Yes, ma'am. They do. We need you to come inside. There's something you need to see." She walked back into her home, flanked by the 2 officers, feeling like a stranger, a visitor in her own life. They walked down the hallway to her bedroom. The door was open, and the trail of muddy footprints led directly into the room. They stopped in the center of the floor, right beside her neatly made bed. But that wasn't what the officer wanted her to see. He pointed to the floor. The footprints didn't just stop. There was a second set of footprints, leading away from the bed. They led out of the bedroom, back down the hall, and out the front door. They were a perfect, identical match to the first set. The intruder had walked into her bedroom, stood beside her bed, and then had walked right back out. But why? What had he done? She scanned the room, her eyes darting around, searching for what was wrong. The bed was still made. Her jewelry box on the dresser was untouched. Her laptop on her desk was still there. Everything was normal. She whispered, "I don't understand." "He didn't take anything," the female officer said, her voice soft, but with a hard, clinical edge. Single quotes. My single quotes. Look at the bed. Look closer. At the pillow. Laura's eyes focused on her bed, and then she saw it. On the pillow where she laid her head every single night, there was a small indentation, a slight depression in the fabric. And next to it, almost invisible against the white of the pillowcase, was a single, long strand of dark, greasy hair. That was not her own. He hadn't just stood beside her bed. He had been in her bed. He had laid his head on her pillow, in the space where she slept, where she dreamed. The violation was so profound, so intimate. It was almost abstract. It was a quiet, symbolic act of possession. A statement. This is not your space. It is mine. I can be here whenever I want. The police were thorough, professional. They took samples of the mud. They collected the hair from the pillow. They dusted for fingerprints. But the intruder had been careful. He had warm gloves. There was no usable evidence. The mud, they later told her, was a specific type of red clay, common not in the city, but in the rural areas of Rowan County, a good 40 miles north of Charlotte. It was a clue that led nowhere. Laura never slept in that house again. She broke her lease, lost her security deposit, and moved into a sterile, anonymous, high-rise apartment building on North Tryon Street, a place with a doorman and 100 security cameras. But the fear followed her. She became a prisoner of her own. New routines. She would check the deadbolt on her apartment door a dozen times a night. She would take pictures of her rooms before she left for work, a frantic, obsessive need for a verifiable record of her own reality. The case of the muddy footprints was never solved. The intruder was never found. He was a ghost, a phantom who had walked into her life through a single, forgotten lock and had left behind a permanent, indelible stain on her sense of safety. She is left with a single haunting image that plays in her mind on a loop, a quiet, terrifying home movie. The image of the muddy footprints leading a straight, deliberate path to her bedroom, and she is haunted by a question that she will carry with her for the rest of her life. The footprints led into her room, and then they led out, but she knows with a certainty there's a cold, hard stone in the pit of her stomach, that on that Tuesday morning, in her frantic, chaotic rush to leave for work, she had not only forgotten to lock the door, she had also forgotten to check under the bed.
They're still here.
Our next story is about the modern ghost limb we all carry. The smartphone. It's about the frantic, heart-stopping panic of realizing you've left it behind, and the blind, trusting autopilot that makes us turn back to retrieve it. It comes from a man named Ryan, who learned that sometimes a simple act of forgetfulness can be an accidental invitation to a private, terrifying performance, and that when you go back to the place you just left, you may find that you are no longer in the same reality you were in just a few minutes before. At 31, Ryan's life was a carefully balanced equation of ambition and anxiety. He was a junior architect at a large competitive firm, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, in the heart of downtown Chicago. His days were a grueling marathon of deadlines, 3D modeling, and the constant, soul-crushing pressure to prove himself. His life was a blueprint for a future he wasn't yet sure he could afford. His fiancée, Chloe, a resident doctor at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, was the one true, solid thing in his chaotic world. Their life together was a patchwork of stolen moments, of quiet, exhausted dinners in their small, overpriced apartment in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, a place they had chosen for its proximity to her hospital and its distance from his office. They were a team, two people paddling furiously to keep their heads above the water of their own demanding careers. This particular night was a celebration. It was their 5-year anniversary. For the first time in months, they had a night to themselves. Ryan had made reservations at a place he'd been wanting to try for years, the Publican, a high-end, rustic chic restaurant on West Fulton Market in the trendy West Loop. It was a place of warm light, of reclaimed wood, of the cheerful, boisterous sound of people celebrating life. For a few precious hours, they weren't the stressed out architect and the exhausted doctor. They were just Ryan and Chloe, in love in a beautiful restaurant, the world and its demands a distant, muffled roar. The dinner was perfect. The food was incredible. The conversation, easy and full of the familiar, comfortable rhythms of a long-term relationship. They talked about their future, about the house they would one day buy, about the children they hoped to have. For a few hours, the fortress of their shared dream felt real, impenetrable. At 11 p.m., they left, stepping out of the warm, glowing bubble of the restaurant and into the cool, crisp Chicago night. The streets of the West Loop were still alive with the energy of the city, a comforting, anonymous symphony of traffic and distant sirens. They caught a cab, the familiar yellow a beacon of safety. They sat in the back, holding hands, their silence a comfortable, happy thing. They were halfway home, crossing the bridge over the Chicago River on North LaSalle Drive. The glittering, iconic skyline of the city a perfect cinematic backdrop when Ryan felt it. A sudden, cold, sickening jolt in the pit of his stomach. Phantom weight that was missing from his pocket. His phone. He breathed, his hand slapping his empty pocket. "Oh my God, I left my phone." Chloe looked at him, her happy, relaxed expression replaced by a familiar, weary sympathy. "Are you serious?" he said, his mind already racing. "I think I left it on the table." His entire life was on that phone. His work emails, his project files, his contacts, his entire digital brain. "We have to go back." The cab driver, with the sigh of a man who had seen this particular drama play out 1,000 times, made a U-turn. The mood in the cab shifted. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a tense, anxious quiet. Ryan muttered, a wave of self-loathing washing over him. "I can't believe I did that. It was such a stupid, simple mistake. A crack in the armor of the competent, in-control man he was supposed to be." They pulled up in front of the Publican. The restaurant was quieter now. The dinner rush over. A few patrons were lingering at the bar. Ryan said to Chloe, "You wait here. I'll be right back." 2 minutes. He got out of the cab and walked back to the restaurant's heavy wooden door. The familiar warmth and the sound of clinking glasses and quiet conversation washed over him as he stepped inside. The hostess at the front desk gave him a polite, questioning look. He said, a sheepish smile on his face, "I'm so sorry. I think I left my phone on our table," she said, her smile professional. "No problem. Which table was it?" He pointed to a small 2-person table by the window, and he saw it. His phone, a sleek black rectangle lying innocently on the dark, polished wood right where he had left it. A wave of relief washed over him. He was walking towards the table when he heard a sound from the back of the restaurant, from the direction of the kitchens. A single, loud, metallic crash, followed by a woman's sharp, terrified gasp. The entire restaurant went silent. The few remaining patrons at the bar looked up from their drinks, their conversations dying mid-sentence. The hostess's professional smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion and alarm. And then, the silence was broken by a new sound. The sound of a man's voice, shouting. It was not an angry shout. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated, and terrifying rage. It was a sound that did not belong in this place of expensive food and quiet conversation. It was a sound of primal, violent chaos. The hostess's face went white. She looked at Ryan, her eyes wide with a terror he didn't understand. And then she did something that defied all logic, all customer service training. She brought a single trembling finger to her lips in a universal sign for hush, and then she pointed, her hand shaking, to the door he had just come through. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. Get out. Another crash came from the kitchen, this one louder, the sound of plates shattering. A woman screamed. Ryan didn't wait to understand. He was not a hero. He was an architect. He snatched his phone from the table and ran. He burst out of the restaurant and back into the cold night air, his heart hammering against his ribs. He jumped into the waiting cab, his face a pale mask of terror. He yelled at the driver, "Go! Just go!" The cab sped away from the curb, leaving the warm, inviting glow of the Publican behind. As they drove away, he looked back at the restaurant. And he saw it. A man was thrown out of the kitchen's side door, an employee entrance in the alley. He was one of the line cooks, still in his white uniform. He landed in a heap on the wet pavement. And then, another figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright, chaotic light of the kitchen. A large man. He held something long and dark in his hand. A tire iron. The man on the ground scrambled to his feet and ran, a terrified, animalistic flight. The large man in the doorway watched him go, and then calmly, deliberately, he turned and looked directly at Ryan's retreating cab. as if. He knew with a calm, terrifying certainty that there had been a witness. Chloe whispered, her own face pale, her eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" Ryan said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I don't know. I don't want to know." He told a cab driver to take them to the nearest police station. He had to report it. He had a duty. He had seen a violent assault. They arrived at the Chicago Police Department's 12th District Station on South Racine Avenue. Ryan stumbled inside, his mind still a chaotic mess of what he had just seen. He told his story to the tired-looking desk sergeant, his words a jumbled. Frantic stream of the crash, the scream, the man with the tire iron. The sergeant listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Ryan was finished, the sergeant typed something into his computer, thought he was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up at Ryan, a look of profound, weary confusion on his face. The sergeant said, his voice flat, "Sir, I don't know what you saw, but I can tell you this. We just received an all-points bulletin. The Publican restaurant? It was robbed 10 minutes ago. But it wasn't a man with a tire iron dot. It was a group of 4 men, armed with automatic weapons. They took the entire register, the safe and the wallets and jewelry of every single person in the restaurant." He paused. "They were in and out in under 5 minutes. The first 911 call came in at 11:15. Ryan stared at him, his mind unable to process the words. 11:15? He had left the restaurant at 11. He had gotten back there at around 11:20. The robbery should have been over. The police should have already been there. The sergeant continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And another thing. We have a preliminary report from the first officers on the scene. They've secured the staff and the remaining patrons. They're all safe. A little shaken up, but safe." He leaned forward. "The strange part is, they all have the same bizarre story. They said that right in the middle of the robbery, as the men were grabbing the cash, a single, large, and very calm man, a man none of them had ever seen before, a man who didn't seem to be with the robbery crew, just walked out of the kitchen, told the lead gunman to leave them alone, and then beat him so badly with a tire iron that the other 3 robbers dropped their bags and ran. The man then walked out the back door and disappeared before the police arrived. The world seemed to tilt and fall away. The man with the tire iron, he hadn't been the robber. He had been the one who stopped the robbery. A vigilante. A ghost, Ryan whispered. But the staff, they were hiding. They were terrified. "Of course they were," the sergeant said. "There were 4 men with guns in their restaurant, and then a 5th man who was, according to the witnesses, even more terrifying than the robbers." The final, horrifying, and deeply paradoxical truth of the night began to settle in Ryan's mind. His simple, mundane act of forgetting his phone had not led him into a robbery. It had led him into the brief, violent, and secret aftermath of a heroic, or perhaps just brutally territorial, act of violence. The staff hadn't been hiding from a robber. They had been hiding from their savior. He was left with a story that made no sense, a story he could never tell. He was the only witness to a crime that had been stopped by an even more terrifying act of violence, committed by a man who had appeared from nowhere and had vanished. Back into it, he and Chloe finally took a cab home, the silence in the car a heavy, buzzing thing. He now had his phone, but the small, black rectangle felt alien in his hand, a cursed object, a key that had unlocked a door to a world he was never meant to see. He now lives with a profound and deeply unsettling knowledge. He knows that the city, his city, has a secret, violent immune system, that there are men, quiet, watchful men, who exist in the shadows, who are not criminals, and who are not heroes. There's something else, and he knows that sometimes the only thing separating a normal, happy anniversary dinner from a scene of brutal, bloody chaos is a simple, forgetful, and very, very lucky act of leaving your phone behind.
You forgot something.
Our final story is about the quiet, brutal randomness of fate. It's about how the smallest, most insignificant mistake, a simple act of forgetfulness born from exhaustion, can become the one single thing that stands between your family and an unthinkable, fiery end. It comes from a new father named Tom, who learned that sometimes the most profound act of protection is not a heroic deed, but a simple, life-saving, and utterly accidental oversight. At 32, Tom's world had been beautifully, terrifyingly, and completely upended. His and his wife's, Anna's, life had, for the past 3 months, been dictated by the whims of a tiny, perfect, and relentlessly demanding human being. Their son, Leo, they lived in a small starter home in a sprawling, new development in Scottsdale, Arizona, a place called Desert Ridge. The neighborhood was a sea of identical, beige stucco houses, a place of pristine sidewalks, and a profound, almost unnerving sense of quiet order. It was, by all accounts, the safest place in the world. But for Tom and Anna, the real world had shrunk to the 4 walls of their house. A world that revolved around 2-hour sleep cycles, the constant low-grade hum of a baby monitor, and a love so fierce it was almost painful. Tom was a high school science teacher. He was a man of logic, of predictable variables, of cause and effect. But the sleepless nights were eroding his orderly mind, leaving him in a perpetual state of foggy exhaustion. He and Anna were a team, but they were a team running on fumes. Their life was a quiet, desperate dance of trying to remember who had last fed the baby, who had last changed a diaper, who had last slept for more than an hour at a time. The world outside their small, climate-controlled sanctuary, the world of careers and friends and current events, had faded into a distant, irrelevant buzz. The act of forgetfulness that would save their lives happened on a hot, still, Thursday night. Leo had been particularly fussy, a low-grade fever making him restless, an inconsolable. By 1 a.m., both Tom and Anna were frayed, their patience worn down to a raw nerve. It was Tom's turn to try and soothe the crying baby. He went to the kitchen to prepare a bottle, his movements slow and clumsy with exhaustion. He opened the cabinet, and his heart sank. The can of formula, the specific, sensitive stomach brand that was the only thing Leo could tolerate, was empty. An empty metal cylinder that was a testament to a profound and deeply human failure of planning. He had been the one to go to the local Safeway on North Tatum Boulevard that afternoon. He had a list: milk, bread, diapers, and formula. He remembered getting the diapers. He remembered the milk, but the formula he had simply forgotten. Single simple oversight in the fog of his exhaustion. He whispered, walking back into the bedroom, the empty can in his hand. "Anna, I'm so sorry. I forgot the formula." Anna, who had just managed to rock Leo to a fitful sleep, looked at him, and he could see the last of her energy reserves drain from her face. She didn't get angry. She was too tired to be angry. She just looked defeated. She whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Okay, it's okay. What do we do?" He said instantly. The guilt was a sharp, physical thing. "I'll go. This was my mistake. I had to fix it. There's a 24-hour Walgreens on Bell Road. It's only a 15-minute drive. I'll be back before he even knows I'm gone," Anna said, her eyes on the sleeping baby in her arms. "Don't leave him, Tom. Don't leave him alone." "I won't," he said. "I'll take him with me. You stay here. You sleep. Please. Just for a little while." It was a small, quiet negotiation between 2 exhausted parents, a simple, mundane decision born of a simple, mundane mistake. but it was a decision. That would be the difference between life and death. He gently lifted the sleeping Leo from Anna's arms, buckled him into his car seat in the back of their Honda Pilot, and drove off into the silent, sleeping suburban night. The streets of Scottsdale were empty, the identical beige houses, all dark. The air was warm and still. He drove with the windows down, the dry desert air a welcome shock to his tired mind. He felt a profound, almost overwhelming, sense of love as he glanced in the rearview mirror at his sleeping son. This was his world. This small, perfect, fragile human being. And he had almost failed him, all because he had forgotten to buy a can of formula. He reached the Walgreens. The store was an island of harsh, fluorescent light in the darkness. He was the only customer. He found the formula, paid for it, and was back in his car in under 10 minutes. The drive home was a quiet one. The guilt had begun to recede, replaced by a simple, paternal relief. He had fixed his mistake. He was bringing home the food. He was the provider, the protector. He turned onto their street, a quiet, looping road called Sanctuary Lane. He was about a half mile from his house when he saw it. A strange, flickering orange glow against the dark, desert sky. His first thought was a bonfire. Teenagers, maybe, in one of the many half-finished construction sites that dotted the neighborhood. But as he got closer, the glow grew brighter, more frantic, and he could smell it. The thick, acrid smell of smoke. A cold, sick feeling began to creep up his spine. He pressed his foot on the accelerator, the car lurching forward. He rounded the final corner onto his own quiet cul-de-sac sack dot, and his world ended. His house, his sanctuary, his fortress of beige stucco and new parent dreams was on fire. It wasn't a small fire. The entire back of the house was engulfed in a roaring, furious, and impossibly fast-moving inferno. Flames were pouring from the windows of their bedroom, of the nursery, licking at the night sky. The orange glow he had seen from a mile away was his own life, being consumed by a violent, unstoppable rage. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the street. For a single, eternal, heart-stopping second, his mind went completely blank. And then, a single, pure, an animalistic scream of a name tore from his throat. Anna. He threw the car door open, his body moving on pure, unthinking instinct. He was halfway across his own lawn, running towards the burning building, when he was hit by a wall of heat so intense it singed his eyebrows and drove him back. He could hear the roar of the fire, the sickening crash of shattering glass, and he could hear the first distant approaching wail of fire trucks. He stood on the perfect manicured lawn of his neighbor, a helpless, screaming, and broken man, watching his entire world turn to ash. The firefighters from the Scottsdale Fire Department arrived, their movements a calm, professional ballet in the midst of his personal hell. They found Anna. She had been asleep in the living room, on the couch at the front of the house, the one room the fire had not yet reached. The smoke had woken her. She was alive, choking, terrified, but alive. They were reunited on the cold, wet pavement of the street, two refugees from their own life, wrapped in rough wool blankets. Their sleeping son, Leo, passed between them, a small, warm, an impossibly precious anchor in a world that had just been utterly destroyed. The investigation that followed was a slow, methodical, and horrifying process. The fire marshal, a grim-faced, seen-it-all man named Peterson, confirmed what Tom had already known in his gut dot. This had not been an accident. There was no faulty wiring, no forgotten candle dot. It was arson. The fire had been started with a powerful, fast-burning accelerant poured along the entire back wall of the house, and the point of origin, the place where the fire had burned the hottest, the longest, the most viciously, was directly under the window of the nursery, the room that had been built for their son. The attack had not been random. It had been personal. It had been targeted. It had been designed to kill them all in their sleep. But who? Why? They were a normal family. They had no enemies. They were new to the neighborhood. They barely knew their neighbors. The police investigation turned up nothing. No witnesses, no suspects. No motive. The case was a complete, terrifying, and total mystery. The final, horrifying resolution to that mystery came a year later, 1,000 miles away. They had left Arizona. They couldn't stay. The memory of the fire was a ghost that haunted every corner of that perfect, sun-baked city. They had moved to a small town in Oregon to be closer to Anna's family, to try and rebuild their lives from the ashes. One day, Tom was reading an article on an online news aggregator, a story from a national wire service. The headline read, "Domestic terrorist cell apprehended in Phoenix." The article described the arrest of a small, radical, anti-suburban activist group, a group that believed the sprawling, master-planned communities of cities like Scottsdale were a cancer on the earth, a group that had been engaging in a quiet, anonymous campaign of what they called architectural terrorism. They would target new, unoccupied homes in these developments, setting them on fire in the middle of the night. A twisted, violent protest against urban sprawl. And then, he read the sentence that made his blood run cold. The group had recently escalated their tactics. According to the FBI, they have begun targeting homes that were occupied. Their method was to choose a house at random, and then, using publicly available property records, they would monitor the family, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect, quiet, moonless night to strike. The article listed the addresses of the homes they had targeted, and the last address on the list was his. The final, horrifying truth was not that the fire had been personal. It had been the opposite. It had been a completely, utterly, and terrifyingly random act of violence. A roll of the dice by a group of strangers with a twisted ideology. They hadn't been targeted because of who they were. They had been targeted because of where they lived. They had been chosen as a symbol. He was left with a knowledge so profound, so heavy, it was almost impossible to bear. The course of his entire life had been changed, his home destroyed, his family almost annihilated, not by a grand, dramatic act of fate, but by a single, mundane, and almost comical mistake, his own sleep-deprived, new parent forgetfulness. He had been so ashamed that night, so consumed with guilt for forgetting the formula. He had seen himself as a failure, as a bad father, but his failure, his simple, human error, was the only thing that had saved them. If he hadn't forgotten, he and his son would have been in the house, asleep, in the room where the fire had started. He was left with a horrifying, beautiful, and inescapable paradox. The worst mistake he had ever made as a father was the one single thing that had allowed him to be a father at all. He had been saved by his own imperfection. He now lives with a strange and deeply unsettling sense of gratitude. He is grateful for his exhaustion, for his fogginess, for his simple, human, and life-saving act of forgetting to buy the baby's milk. But he is also haunted by the quiet, chilling knowledge of the other timeline. The timeline where he was a better, more organized, more responsible parent. The timeline where he remembered the formula. The timeline where he and his wife and his son were all at home, asleep, at 2 a.m. on a quiet, still, and moonless Thursday night, when the world outside their bedroom window was suddenly and silently set on fire. A forgotten lock that led to the discovery of a silent, watching intruder. A forgotten phone that led a man back to the scene of a brutal act of vigilantism. And a forgotten can of baby formula. That, in an act of beautiful, terrifying irony, saved a family from a fiery grave. These three stories began with the most human of all errors, a simple oversight, a momentary lapse in our meticulously constructed routines. We live our lives believing we are in control, that our plans and our memories are the solid bedrock of our existence. But these accounts serve as a chilling reminder that we are all just one tiny mistake away from a completely different reality. The true horror in these stories is not the threat itself, but the profound, terrifying randomness of the outcome. A forgotten key can invite a monster in, or it can be the one thing that leads you away from danger. That it is the chilling realization that our lives are not a series of grand, heroic choices, but a delicate, fragile dance with chaos, where the smallest, most insignificant misstep can be the difference between a normal life and an unimaginable nightmare, or sometimes between a nightmare and a miracle. They leave us with a question that will forever haunt the quiet, mundane moments of our lives. The next time you forget something, the next time your routine is broken, is it just a mistake? Or is it the hand of fate pushing you towards a door you were never meant to open, or pulling you away from a future you were never meant to have? If these stories have made you think twice about the small, forgotten details of your own life, prove you remember by subscribing to Whispered Fear, leaving a like, and sharing this video. Your support helps us to piece together these terrifying fragments of what might have been. But what if the horror isn't a single, fleeting event, but a constant, quiet presence? What if the threat isn't a mistake you made, but the very place you call home? Click the video on your screen now as we unlock the door to our next collection. 3 true scary stories from people who lived in a haunted apartment. See you there. If you're not afraid of your new neighbors,